Today we're going to be talking about geriatrics and how to age gracefully throughout the lifespan.
And when we say geriatrics, we mean our older friends. We're going to be talking about
the next station is
how you can
Richland Hills.
Gracefully age. I know that might be a touchy subject for some, and you're probably looking at us like, what do you know about aging? You guys are 20, you're 22?
22.
22, and I'm 28, so what do we know about aging?
2 decades of experience.
That's right. Almost three. Almost three. But we've been learning some things over the last couple of weeks that we wanted to share that we think is important, especially if you are younger and you'd like to age more gracefully. We're going to cover some topics today.
Yeah. So the concept I'd like to think about is the distinction between the chronological age and the biological age.
Mm-hmm.
So if you age gracefully, if you do the tools in this that we're about to speak about, right, your chronological age might be 60, but your biological age could be 2 decades younger. So,
or 2 decades older.
Or 2 decades older, right?
Mm-hmm.
So like the way you can think about this is if you can imagine a 6-year-old doing the splits, right? Flexibility is a dimension of fitness. And so if you train that intentionally and your hamstrings and your hip flexors allow you to get into the splits as a 6-year-old, most 20-year-olds can't do that.
Yeah.
And it's not because one's chronological age makes them able to do that. It's biological age and modifiable actions to produce a result.
So when it comes to talking about aging, there's the term normal aging versus average aging. So normal would reference what is normal with just aging, and then there's average, which is what typically occurs at certain ages. And it's important to realize that the average 60-year-old in the U.S. is not the same as the average 60-year-old in Japan. So when you're talking about those components of fitness that you work on and how it relates to aging, usually those healthier cultures practice something in their daily life that leads to them aging better biologically and chronically. Well, chronically they're going to age the same. Biologically, they age better because they have those factors.
Right, and if you think about the difference of demographics, how people age in different geographical areas are also tied to culture. So it's, the Japan example you brought up, what do they eat? Sushi, raw fish, super healthy stuff.
Complex carbs, not simple sugars.
I mean, their diet is getting Americanized or Westernized, so I think they're starting to see some of the same issues that we have been seeing for the past few decades.
At least in the more urban areas.
Right, but I think it's important to look at I think they're called blue zones, or the healthy zones, where people can, have higher than average life expectancies and higher than average health span expectancies. So people who are more functional into their older ages.
Mm-hmm.
So what are the things that we can do to, kind of get us that extra health span in our lives?
Well, the first thing we have is aerobic exercise. Regular aerobic exercise is extremely important. So we measure that in VO2 max, but I think the general public can measure it with like the talk test. What sort of exercise intensity can they sustain and still be able to have a conversation? Is a good measure of like how strong their cardiovascular fitness is. So what kind of benefits do we get from aerobic exercise? We get,
the next station is
angiogenesis,
Richland Hills.
our mitochondrial density.
What does that mean?
Thank you. So angiogenesis is just the increase in blood vessels, especially to your working muscles.
Also your brain, right?
And to your brain, to your heart in a good way. Lungs, like basically any organ system that's involved in aerobic exercise is going to have a better cardiovascular blood vessel density. It's going to allow you to get oxygen to those areas more efficiently, faster, than if you didn't exercise. And then other things that you see is like mitochondrial density. So you've heard since third grade that the mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell.
Right. So only thing I remember from third grade.
Right. Aerobic exercise is directly linked to increasing both the number and the function of mitochondria. So utilize oxygen more efficiently and to a greater capacity to create energy.
Mm-hmm.
And that's only going to benefit you later on in life.
Right, yeah. I think your energy levels could go up, right? Your ability to do functional activities like cooking or cleaning or even just like walking up and down a flight of stairs. If you train cardiovascularly, you're essentially adapting those mitochondria to use oxygen and transform that into energy. And I think that's when people get like easily fatigued, it's because their mitochondria are not adapted. And that's something we can modify. And like the American College of Sports Medicine, which is like gold standard for health exercise research, they recommend about 150 minutes per week of cardiovascular exercise. And I think that's pretty attainable, thinking about walking and, you know, cycling, running, all of these things that can add up over time. So like if you can't walk a mile, or if you can't run a mile, like walk a mile.
Yeah.
And it's all going to the same mitochondria. It doesn't really matter what the form, you just need to elevate your heart rate 150 minutes a week.
Yeah, and that number actually comes from the American College of Sports Medicine, and that 150 minutes per week is modifiable. So it doesn't have to be exactly 150 minutes.
Mm-hmm.
If you do what's called intensity minutes, where you do some type of high intensity or vigorous exercise. Now, I mean, if you're an older friend and you haven't exercised, maybe talk to a doctor or a professional before you start doing high intensity exercise. But if you do high intensity exercise, it counts for 2 minutes for every 1 minute.
Really?
Yeah, so you don't have to complete 75 minutes of high intensity work per week.
Yeah, I think
Which
another
is totally attainable.
interesting thing about that is if you don't have time formally to go to the gym for 50 minutes, you can microdose aerobics. So like if you work on the 6th floor, you can sprint up flights of stairs, and you know that might take you 15 seconds, 20 seconds, but you're microdosing that aerobic fitness because you're increasing your respiratory rate, or you're stressing the systems metabolically, but just not sustained. So if you can't macrodose, microdosing is going to help you.
Yeah. Well, I think one of the biggest barriers to our older friends getting into aerobic exercise is they think of their age as like, well, when I was younger I could do this, I'm never going to be able to do that. A conditioned
The next station is
deficiency
Richland Hills.
is going to outperform an unconditioned or deconditioned 20-year-old every single time. I look at my mom. She started exercising, I think 2 or 3 years ago, more regularly after she had gallbladder surgery, and like it's a night and day difference. Like she can probably go longer than me on the paddleboard whenever I go down to our lake house, and like you can see the difference in like her skin. It's like even her hair looks like it's more healthy. It's a night and day difference. So, and you don't have to start all out. She just started with something simple like paddling around the lake once a day. And
Yeah.
that was it.
I think that's also important, is to start wherever you're at. I mean, if you're a 20-year-old listening to this, still, like you don't have to start 2-3 times over your working weight, like ego lifting or that kind of thing. I think it's toxic, and it's not what exercise is about. Exercise is about wherever you are, getting a little bit better every day.
Yeah, and just moving.
Yeah. our older friends.
I think it also depends on what condition you're in, and to me, I think it's even more important than. I mean, you should definitely do like aerobic exercise, but I think strength training is extremely vital the older you get.
But in order to reap the biggest benefits, like you want to start earlier.
Mm-hmm.
That being said, you can still reap benefits in your 60s
Yeah.
and 70s, but it's going to be more difficult if you've never had those adaptations before.
I also don't think the science is incredibly concrete about regaining bone density, which we'll talk about with why you want to do strength training and what it affects. But the science of bone density has kind of been back and forth lately. Previously, it's been like once your bone density is a certain amount, you can't improve it, you can only maintain it. But now we're finally starting to actually do loaded exercise like back squats, deadlifts, a bunch of loaded exercise in older populations, and they're starting to see results. And like I've always preached, like loading is extremely important.
Have you seen the YouTube channel Gracefully?
Mm-hmm.
No. Well, it's this dude. I think he's in his 60s. I don't know much about his demographics, but he markets to people in their 6th, 7th, 8th decade and teaches them how to do barbell movements.
Yeah.
And just the footage of like an 80-year-old deadlifting 135 is amazing.
Yeah. There's two channels that I
This
follow
station
that are
is-
extremely like encouraging to older populations. It's barbell medicine and starting strength. They always preach that even if you're 70, 80 years old, you can still do barbell movements. It's just you gotta find your starting point and then work from there.
Yeah.
Like with anything.
I think that a good starting point for strength training is, I think, half an hour twice a week, bare minimum, for strength training exercises. Personally, I like to do
Passengers,
3 days a week.
please report any unattended
but
property
really, 2 days
or
a week
suspicious
loading
behavior.
full
Never
body
report.
exercises like squats and deadlifts and overhead presses.
Yeah.
That'll get you the most bang for your buck, because strength training is about increasing your strength of your muscles, but also as you said, the bone mineral density. And when you impose like a demand on your tissues, you get what's called Wolff's Law, right? And that's basically the concept that whatever adaptation you put onto a tissue, you're imposing a stress, and depending on your nutrition and your sleep, you'll adapt to that stress to become stronger over time.
So I think the two biggest pathologies or like things that affect your body that strength training addresses is osteopenia and
Sarcopenia.
and sarcopenia, but osteopenia and osteoporosis and sarcopenia are the
Which
two.
basically just means decrease. So osteo is bone, penia is like low, so low bone,
Yeah.
and then sarco is muscle, penia is low, so low muscle.
Yeah. So sarcopenia usually starts age 50, 60. It can start earlier than that, but it's key to address it when you're younger. So, and I also think the science isn't completely ironed out with this either. So, right now, current research says that peak muscle mass occurs around age 30, and then you have decreases in muscle mass every decade, and they think it's age related. I think that's hogwash. I think you can still develop muscle mass well into your 50s if you have that foundation.
Right. No, I agree with you, but I think it's definitely correlation and not causation.
Yeah.
Because your hormones, like testosterone, peak for sure in your 20s and 30s.
Yeah.
And testosterone is a marker of anabolic response to exercise. So I think there's correlations to show that it's harder to gain strength and muscle as you age,
I'd give you that.
but it's not causing a decrease
Yeah.
unless you're atrophy, chronic bed rest, that kind of thing.
Yeah. And then we already talked about osteopenia and osteoporosis or bone loss and how strength training affects bone density. So now we can go into stretching.
Yeah, so I think as we age, we move less, unfortunately, and I think that can cause, as PTs we know, contractures, or where your muscle tissue, your connective tissue gets chronically stuck in a position because people get stuck in postures, they get stuck in the same activities every day, and that lack of variation in their, like the movement of their joints, can cause stiffness and inflexibility and just general dysfunction for people as they're trying to live their everyday life.
Yeah, I also think it's important to address, like, sometimes it goes the opposite way. So, like, a lot of times people get very
The
stiff.
next station is Bell.
It gets hard for them to move, but other times they move way too much. And stretching may not be indicated for that. If that's the case, you should probably talk to your primary care
Right.
provider or PT maybe, and talk about strength training, because that's more instability, but that's kind of off track. But yes, stretching is extremely important if you are in those chronic positions, if you maybe have been sedentary or not very active the last few years, just to regain any lost range of motion.
I think there's a push in the profession to go towards more of a primary care provider perspective. So instead of a physical therapist being a specialist, we would be more of like, hey, go see your physical therapist once a year so that we can analyze your posture, analyze your deficits before they develop into more chronic conditions. I think that's really smart because, going to a doctor once a year, I mean, you might catch cancer, but which is still important. But I'm saying, like, a physical therapist, like over the course of 7-8 decades, just one holistic view, where if you're 30, 40, 50, and you get that posture corrected, you get that impingement corrected, the amount of, I guess, pain and suffering that we can prevent with just 1-2 sessions of, like, stepping back, looking at the whole picture instead of just, like, as you said, if you're hypermobile, maybe don't stretch. What most people don't understand, if a joint is hypomobile. So that's where we step in. I think we can do a lot of benefit for people.
Yeah.
That way.
Because, like, if you Google my neck hurts, the first thing Google is going to tell you is stretch your neck. But if you already, like, move really well with your neck, and you're stuck in a certain position, like a forward head position, you want to strengthen the muscles that are going to help you maintain that posture, rather than stretch the ones that are already loose.
So I think stretching is important, and I think it's not more or less important than strength or cardiovascular exercise. I think they're all equally important, because if you can't have the mobility to reach overhead and your job is painting, like, overhead, then you're going to be very dysfunctional and your quality of life is going to decrease. So what are some things that just people can do every day, like yoga, what kind of stuff?
Yoga might be a little too extreme. I think Tai Chi is one of the more popular activities older adults can do. I think one of our older patients talks about Tai Chi and how it's helped her regain a lot of range of motion. Anything that's not, like, incredibly extreme, I would say. Something you can also focus on, like, almost like mind meditation while you're doing it. Focus on your breathing while you're doing it. That's extremely huge, is being able to appropriately breathe while you're doing activity.
The next station is
breathing.
Bell.
But like you said, I think stretching is most indicated for regaining function. So if your stretching routine can mimic your function or the activity you want to regain, I think that's the most ideal.
Yeah, this, like, kind of the specificity outlook, I think, is the way to approach that. But just, I guess, a systemic, like, dynamic
This station
stretch
is
before you
Bell.
do cardio or you do strength training. Dynamic as in, like, leg swings, butt kicks, that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
Get the full range of motion. It's going to help most people. You don't necessarily have to static stretch for 10 minutes every joint.
Mm-hmm.
But, yeah, if your PT prescribes that to you, go for it. I think the other thing is posture. So, like, fixing your posture before it becomes pathological
Mm-hmm.
prevents those contractures in the long run. And so now that we've done the 3 major systems, so, like, as we age, what are the things that we do that can be detrimental, like opiates and alcohol?
Yeah, so
The next station is Centerport DFW Airport.
there's adaptive and maladaptive coping strategies. So adaptive would be regular strength training, aerobic exercise, adequate sleep, adequate nutrition, trying to make positive changes that are going to affect those like dysfunction, disability, whatever it may be. Maladaptive would be your mental state, like, I can't do this, so I'm not going to do this. And then using maybe substances or like avoiding activity, stuff like that, that's going to prevent you from getting better.
Yeah, I think a lot of the times, like, people with chronic low back pain get prescribed opiates, and they use that as a maladaptive, I guess, or something that's going to cause them harm over the long run.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess what we're trying to push you to is, like, meditation or a non-opiate intervention, like cognitive behavioral therapy, to provide, like, psychological relief if that's what you need, right? But, like, a social system is free, and it can help buffer you against kind of the ups and downs of life. So, like, that's what we're kind of talking about. And smoking can cause COPD, obstructive disorder, cancer, and increased mortality. So, like, consider healthier alternatives, which you already know that.
Yeah.
And then nutrition.
So, we've gone over nutrition, I don't even know how many times now. Protein, especially the older you get.
Why protein?
So, when you age, protein synthesis, or the building of new tissue through the use of proteins, decreases with age.
So it's harder to use what you eat.
Mm-hmm. So you actually want to increase your protein intake. And we want to get this out there before we get too deep into nutrition. We're not nutritionists. If you have, like, if you think it's a sticking issue with whatever you're struggling with, go speak to a nutritionist.
Mm-hmm.
But adequate protein intake, I think vitamin D is huge, because as we age, it gets harder for us to get vitamin D naturally.
What does vitamin D do for people?
So vitamin D is one of the precursors to increasing bone density. So if you don't have adequate amounts of vitamin D, it doesn't get turned into bone.
If you do have osteoporosis or osteopenia, you should most likely be supplementing with vitamin D3 and calcium, because that's what your bones are made out of, in addition to protein and collagen.
Yeah, but again, speak to a nutritionist about how much you need and how often you need to do it. Yeah. Calcium, another big one for bone density. Zinc, magnesium. Magnesium might be tricky, especially when we talk about, like, what's called polypharmacy, or the more drugs you take as you age, the more likely these vitamins might have interactions with those drugs. But yeah, calcium, vitamin D, magnesium, zinc, I think are probably the biggest vitamins I would harp on.
I think, so those are some of the micronutrients, but what about, like, the overall BMI of patients, like calorie intake? Because a healthy BMI, I mean, Well, so BMI is basically
The
just
next station
a
is
very archaic
Centerport
way to
DFW
say if you
Airport.
are at risk for cardiovascular disease or, you know, these different metrics. So it's just like your waist circumference in relation to your height is how you measure BMI. So if you have, you know, a higher body mass, you might have a higher BMI, and then that could lead to these things like high cholesterol, atherosclerosis, hypertension, a lot of the things that we see increasingly as we age.
Mm-hmm. And then I think the opposite side of the spectrum comes into even more, or it becomes of even more importance with aging, because you start to worry about what's called frailty. Basically, when loss of bone mass, muscle mass starts to affect your daily function, it puts you at risk for even more disability. So finding that balance of caloric intake, how much you need, how much protein you should be getting, is extremely important when you age.
Yeah, I think definitely need to pay attention to protein, also water intake, because we